Welcome to this retrospective / review for Final Fantasy V. In particular, I will be talking about the version that I purchased on Steam, which was an older version that is no longer available for purchase, since they have replaced it with a pixel remaster version of this game. And this was the same version of the game that was available on iOS and Android as well, but it's no longer available there either. So we should probably go ahead and cut to the chase and ask the glaring question, basically the elephant in the room. Did Square really need to delist this game? And I think I'd probably say, in my personal opinion, probably not. Now, their original belief behind why they would keep the older versions of Final Fantasy 3 and 4 available is because those were the 3D version and they had a bigger graphical overhaul than, say, the versions of Final Fantasy 5 and 6 that were previously available on Steam. And one thing I would like to point out is I was kind of a little worried about this game to a certain extent because it did have a bit of a negative reputation. A lot of it in regards to the graphics of the game. And be completely honest with you all, I'm not really sure why it had such a negative reaction. Now, to be fair, I've never played any version of Final Fantasy V. Not the obviously the original version, which came out in Japan only on the Super Famicom, technically. I didn't play the PlayStation port that came out later, or even the Game Boy Advance version. I'm not sure if there was any other version of this game available prior to this one, of course, but this is the first time I've ever played the game. Now, I will say that for my own playthrough, it's actually going to be very similar to what you would get in the pixel remaster version of the game. So, from that perspective, I feel that my review should be, fairly accurate as far as that's concerned as well. So there is certain things about this game that is not in the pixel remaster. And so for that perspective, I feel that Square Enix really kind of dropped the ball a little bit on the pixel remaster, not on this one. So would I have liked the graphics in the pixel remaster compared to this version? Possibly, but honestly, the graphics themselves weren't really that bad, in my personal opinion. I guess I was just expecting it to be just, very subpar, and maybe it's just because I'm a little more, I don't know, open-minded, for lack of a better word. I just didn't really mind the graphics in the game. I'd heard some negative responses about the user interface, and I feel like the user interface worked just fine. It worked well. I mean, not really any different than any of the other Final Fantasy games that I've played on Steam so far, so I don't really have any problems with the user interface either. Now, I did play with a control, so did that make things a little bit better? Possibly. Now, the one thing I will say as a criticism of the user interface is that it was designed with a keyboard in mind. And so when there were certain prompts on the screen, for instance, basically when you're flying the airship around and you had to fly up into the atmosphere to go after the, you wouldn't call it an airship, but almost like a spaceship, basically, or a space base or something floating in the atmosphere. It was saying you had to hit, was it X or Z? I can't remember what particular keyboard entry it said you had to hit, but it was basically designed with the keyboard in mind, and it didn't take into consideration when you were using a controller the different buttons that you would have to press. And not a huge issue, really. Basically, I figured out what button to push just by pushing random buttons to figure out what was needed, basically, especially like when I was dealing with the submarine. So from that perspective, I guess that you could give it a little bit of criticism in the fact that the UI is very simple. It was, with the prompts, it was only designed for a keyboard player in mind, basically. So from that perspective, I definitely say you could give it some criticism. But personally, the graphics of the game, they didn't bother me one bit. Now, obviously, the music, it's a Final Fantasy game. I just don't think you can go wrong with pretty much any of the music in this game. The music is just, amazing. I always have a very soft spot in my heart for the Final Fantasy soundtracks. They're all very similar to each other, but also at the same time, they do have unique twists on each of the iconic themes, or there's just, specific themes to each game that are specific to that particular game. I think, for instance, like the fight music against Gilgamesh is probably something you'll only hear in Final Fantasy V. So I don't think there's anybody who can really objectively give a negative review of the soundtrack to the game, at least in my personal opinion. That's something that's consistently been pretty good across pretty much every Final Fantasy game that I've ever played. Granted, there's still quite a few I haven't played, but I have a feeling that's one of the things that's consistent throughout the series, no matter what. Now, as far as this game is concerned, obviously one of the big features of it is the job system. And one of the reasons why I'm not really sure why Square delisted this game is because this game is technically the most complete version of Final Fantasy that there is. Because there are 3 jobs in the game that are only available here in this version and in the Game Boy Advance. That would be the Cannoneer, the Oracle, and the Gladiator. To be fair to the Pixel Remaster, the only one of those classes I've actually truly tried playing with at this point is the Gladiator. And it's a pretty decent class, but it does seem to be a bit of a cookie cutter to a lot of the other melee type classes. So is it a big loss for the Pixel Remaster players? I mean, that's kind of up in the air. But technically, those 3 classes are available in this game, and this version of the game has something the Game Boy Advance version doesn't have, and that's the Necromancer class, which I still haven't unlocked because you have to go through the post-game content. Which, as I could say, like, the reason why I feel my review is accurate to the Pixel Remaster is that, to the best of my knowledge, there is no post-game content for the Pixel Remaster. Now, I could be mistaken about that because obviously I don't have the game and I don't feel any need or reason to purchase the Pixel Remaster because it's really the only thing I'd be paying for would be the facelift for all intents and purposes. I don't think there's any mechanical reason that I would want to get the Pixel Remaster. But if you don't have any version of Final Fantasy V, most likely the Pixel Remaster will be a good choice for you to try and play this game. Now, of the game itself, we should talk about certain things like, well, the story. Now, the story itself, I feel is actually pretty good. Probably, I'm trying to think, if I could compare it to Final Fantasy IV, which game do I feel had bigger stakes? And at the end of the day, I don't know, they all had pretty good, stakes as far as the games are concerned. But I feel like you got to know the characters better in Final Fantasy IV because there's also more characters involved. In this one, you have, basically the same 4, 5 main characters. It's very similar to Final Fantasy III in that regards. It's mostly the same characters. Having said that, people that basically die in this version of the game, or in this game, not version, in this game, most of them stay dead. Unlike in Final Fantasy IV, where you find out later, it's like, oh, this guy actually survived, or this guy is just knocked out, he's not dead. And so, from that perspective, in a way, the stakes are a little bit higher in Final Fantasy V compared to 4, in the fact that when you see someone, pass away in this game, they stay dead. They don't come back, basically. Not in their physical form, at least. They do make an appearance towards the end of the game, but that's another story for another time, basically. But I feel like the story itself it's adequate. It does the job. Very similar in the feeling with Final Fantasy IV, the fact that every time you got to a crystal, it would break or something every single time. So very similar to how Final Fantasy IV, like every time I got to go get a crystal, the main bad guy would show up and snatch it away from you. So in that regards, it's almost exactly the same. Like you never ever get to the crystals in time to stop the bad event from happening. You always get there just in time to see everything shatter. So that's kind of a weird trope, but you know, it is what it is. It's just there to kind of progress the story. And then the shards of the crystals are your excuse to try out the different jobs. And when you speak of the jobs, other than the ones I already mentioned that were unique to this game, in a way, it's a bit of a mixed bag. A lot of the jobs are really good. I enjoy playing with quite a few of them. I will say some of the jobs I haven't really got around to trying yet because they just don't seem like anything I'd be interested in. So there's a lot of extra jobs in this game. So there's a heck of a lot more jobs in this game than, say, Final Fantasy III, which is the last mainline entry that also had a job system. The only other Final Fantasy game I've ever played that had a job system would be Final Fantasy Tactics. And, well, it's been a really long time since I played that game, to say the least. But, so I could say that comparing this one to Final Fantasy III, there's a much more extensive job system. And at the same time, a lot of the jobs just, they're not as appealing to me, to be completely honest with you. Some of the jobs I feel are quite hamstrung, actually. Like one of my favorite jobs is the Red Mage, of course. Favorite color is red. And the Red Mage just, I don't know, it's so incredibly gimped in this game, to say the least. But not only is it gimped, it's also like the most expensive class in the game to level up. Now, one of the things I do want to give this game credit for is, in a way, I do like how they do the leveling system for the individual jobs, how it's much better in this game than compared to Final Fantasy III. So in Final Fantasy III, you had to get each individual job, at least from an achievement perspective, basically, you had to get each individual job up to 99 for each character. So you're, grinding levels. I can't even tell you how many hours I spent in Final Fantasy III just grinding levels for no reason. So I would sit and watch YouTube on my laptop while I'm sitting here just mindlessly killing things in Final Fantasy III. This game is not the same way. In fact, depending on where you are in the game, you might get job levels very quickly. So from that perspective, that's another thing that is definitely improved in this game as compared to Final Fantasy III. It's just the fact that you have so many different jobs to try out and use, and some definitely have more utility than others, to say the least. But the job system itself can also be a boon and a hindrance at the same time. So certain creatures in the game, like the guy I just run across here, basically, you have to have very specific abilities in place. And so the freelancer job, for all intents and purposes, eventually becomes the best job in the game. Because the more jobs you master, the better the freelancer class becomes. And so mastering jobs is vital to improving that job's capabilities, but that job can also, or you can call it the base job if you will, it can use pretty much almost every weapon and armor item in the game, and you can pick and choose which certain skills or abilities, you can use. For the most part, the game itself was not incredibly difficult until I got towards the end. And I don't think it was a matter of me being under-leveled. Okay, actually, let me roll back real quick. There was that one other fight, what was its name? Atomos, which was actually, that was a difficult fight. So that one's about midway through the game. So the Atomos fight was difficult. But then once I got to the final dungeon, that was also where things got to be a little more difficult. And it wasn't because of being under-leveled. It was because I didn't have the right abilities selected. And for instance, the final battle, I had tried a bunch of different combinations of everything I could think of. And there's just certain times in this game where if you just get unlucky, your party gets wiped out. Especially there towards the end, to say the least. And I guess there were just certain things that just didn't click in my head as to what specific abilities I needed. For the most part, it wasn't something that hindered my enjoyment of the game for the most part. But the final boss was one of those almost rage-inducing boss fights where I ended up, after trying to beat him for a very long time. Let's put it that way. Not several hours, because it wasn't several hours, but it did take me a long time, and I just kind of threw up my hands, and then I looked up how to beat him, and that's how I found out that you just basically need to throw money at him using the samurai ability, and that was actually the key to beating the final boss of the game. And I guess, I don't know, in my personal opinion, you should have more viable options, theoretically, to beat certain bosses, but there was just that small handful of creatures in the game, or bosses, not creatures, just bosses, not really any of your standard monsters. There's a small handful of bosses that, if you don't have the right abilities set and or jobs, they can wipe the floor with you. And that definitely is something that happened here for sure. In Final Fantasy IV, that never really was a thing. I don't think I can't really remember any boss in Final Fantasy IV that truly challenged me. There was one Golbez fight that was somewhat challenging, but it was mostly because I had to turn down the active battle system because it was just moving too quickly. Outside of that, it wasn't that difficult of a fight, really. But this game, the job system, like I said, it's very expansive, and there's a lot to it, but at the same time, it can be an Achilles heel and introduce a little more challenge to the game than, some other Final Fantasies, basically. Outside of that, though, I feel the game, from a story perspective and everything else, it is a really good game, and I enjoyed playing it. I think I'm sitting at about halfway through with all the achievements, so I do have a lot of stuff to do yet, and there's the post-game content, which I haven't got to yet. So from that perspective, the post-game content is not something you would see in the Pixel Remaster. So what I have done to this point is also fairly similar to what someone buying the game now would actually experience, with a different facelift for the most part. Basically, there may be some other quality of life improvements that they've done in that game, but for the most part, the games are fairly similar. I have a lot of guides that I use for this, and I'll go ahead and post a lot of them into the description of this video to help you out in case you're wanting to follow achievements. If you have this particular version of the game, there are a lot of replacement guides that have replaced this version specifically for the Pixel Remaster. So the guides that I have may not be as applicable to the Pixel Remaster as they are to this version of the game, but they're fairly similar. And from an achievement perspective, there were certain achievements that you had to be very careful about. Gilgamesh in particular, you had to fight him or had to have him show up 5 different times to get a specific achievement. So there are some missable achievements that really do require a guide. The game itself, not super guide heavy, but there are certain parts where it's not entirely straightforward what your next course of action should be. But outside of achievement hunting, guide usage is somewhat minimal, with the exception of you getting smacked down by specific bosses that you can't seem to handle. So I would say somewhat minimal, at worst moderate guide usage. So that's another thing going for this game, personally, my opinion. But for the most part, it's a good game. I don't think I would put it as high on my list as, say, Final Fantasy IV. I still think Final Fantasy IV is a better game, but I enjoy playing this game, and I think most people will enjoy playing it. The job system, if you're used to a lot of newer Final Fantasies, it may be something you have to get used to, because it's not something that is in some of the more quote-unquote story-driven Final Fantasy games, where you have just a character and that character has a specific job and that's the only job that they have. Whereas this game has a much greater degree of customizability of your characters and your party makeup. So that's definitely a positive for it. But like I said, I think I enjoyed Final Fantasy IV more than I did this game. But I think this game is it's definitely better, in my opinion, than Final Fantasy III. And that's a good game as well, so I don't want to take anything away from that game. But I think this game is an improvement over Final Fantasy III in a lot of areas. The story in this one's better than Final Fantasy III, and the job system is better as well. So from that perspective, definitely a good game to try. I don't want to rate it as highly as Final Fantasy IV, but I think maybe 85% is a little bit too low. I think that maybe a little bit lower, like 87%, we'll say, is probably a good rough estimate. Not quite to the 90% percentile range as far as my personal preferences for the game, but I definitely do not regret playing this game. There was a couple of instances where I got frustrated, but for the most part, frustration was relatively minor and few and far in between, basically. But there was some instances where that happened. If you're considering getting the Pixel remaster, I can definitely wholeheartedly recommend doing it. Obviously it's the only version of the game available now on most platforms. The only thing I think a drawback for the Pixel remaster is all the post-game content that is here is not there anymore, and that is a bit of a shame, but it is what it is. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Final Fantasy V, regardless of which version you get, and it's a good game worth trying. So anyway, thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you all in the next one. Take care.